So before I get to the 6 questions, I want to tell you about why I came up with this ultra brief approach. I started to tell you about where I worked before in the past in the Bronx. Some of you are from Monty, right, in Jacoby. But my motivation for developing this is, I think, a similar kind of pressure-filled situation that you might find yourself in. So just to tell you a brief story, I want to take you back to the early 90s when I was at one of my first jobs out of graduate school. And that was at St. Barnabas Hospital in the Bronx. I worked at St. Barnabas and Union Hospitals. And, you know, one of my first jobs out, you could imagine how inspired you might be. And I remember really wanting to tackle the difficult issues of these psychiatric and addicted patients at St. Barnabas. And, you know, I mean, just as a side note, I remember always driving into work, passing Yankee Stadium, being inspired by that, being a longtime fan. And driving through the Arthur Avenue area, right? Do you guys ever go down there to Belmont? Getting my daily cappuccino at GDO's, feeling good about things. I don't know if you know this, but that area is voted consecutively over many years the safest neighborhood in New York City. But what's 200 yards from there? South Fort Apache, right? One of the most dangerous neighborhoods in New York City. So I remember one day coming in and with my cappuccino still hot, parking the car and coming to the front of the hospital and seeing a lot of staff outside and seeing my unit chief out there. And I went over to him and said, what's everybody up here for? And he goes, look up there. So I look up. He goes, that's your patient on the ledge of that building. So, eager, inspired, motivated myself to make big changes. How did I feel coming into work that day? A little deflated, but I said, what should I do? What do you want me to do? And he goes, nothing, he's not going to jump. So, you know, the anything goes feel of some of the places where we work, and especially there in the Bronx. I guess, listened to him, proceeded into the ED, the ER at the time, right? Nobody said ED for ER then. Or do you guys still say ER? Up at Yale, everybody's saying ED.
It's still in transition.
It's still in transition, right? Well, back then, it's clearly the ER. But what I remember that day, and I think this experience of seeing my own patient, okay, what's it like for a shrink to see his own patient on the ledge of a building? It was really destabilizing. But I went into the ER, where I would start many of my days, and you know, the usual crying and complaining and loud screaming and not very much blood and guts that day, but that usual din wasn't really registering for me. And what I remember that morning, clear as today, was it was as if I could only hear the doctors and the nurses. I didn't hear the patients arguing or fighting back. All I could hear was the doctors and the nurses saying, you have to do this, you need to do that. Here's why. You better go and do it. We don't want to see you here again. Why didn't you do this? Now, I know I make it sound worse than it is, and my memory now, almost 20 years going back, could be affected. So, in the most compassionate of ways, we're saying these things. But why do we chuckle when we hear these things? You have to do this.
You still hear them today.
It reminds us of ourselves.
It reminds us of ourselves, and we cringe and laugh a little. You still hear it today. All the time. But you know what? Let me be even kinder to the professionals that I'm talking about here. They had every right to say everything that they were saying. The person really had to follow up and eat differently or take their medication because they did have really bad diabetes. The patient that I was going to see first to triage for my unit chief was a patient who would never take his medication and would get hospitalized and re-hospitalized for psychotic episodes again and again and again. So their case was solid. No jury would have sided with the patients. But still, there was something wrong that really hit me hardest on that day than any day previous. And that's when I had this aha moment that we really had to radically change how we talk to patients about what we want them to do. Especially at times when we feel really, really justified. Either their outcomes are steadily worsening or it is so transparent, apparent to you what needs to be done, and it seems to be like you're speaking a foreign language, notwithstanding the interpreters and the other things going on in the so I said, where is this other conversation going to come from? Nothing that I had learned in graduate school prepared me for it. I learned how to educate patients. I learned how to change their cognitive distortions, their unrealistic or irrational ways of thinking. That's what I learned in graduate school. I learned to try to correct them just as much as the docs and the nurses were. So when we looked around to see what was available, there was very little but one thing. So in 1991, William Miller and Stephen Rolnick published Motivational Interviewing, Preparing People to Change Addictive Behaviors. And when I read this, I said, well, this is kind of like a really old psychotherapy I learned about in my beginning days of graduate school. But it was very, very unlike the way I and the other people were talking to our patients. Very unlike the way even the cops and the psychiatrists were talking to my patient on the ledge. I discovered later. You have everything to live for. Don't do this. You know, your family will be upset with you. Come on, it's not that bad. All of that was lumped into what I heard the docs and the nurses saying in the ER, and I said, well, we've got to try something different. And what MI represented at that time was a very different way of talking to people. A way that made some of the docs and the nurses that I started to train in it after I learned it cringe. They're like, you can't say that. That'll make the person want to do the bad behavior more. That'll make them think that we're not so interested in having them do it. So what I want to go over today is that very different way of talking, but not the psychotherapy version of it, but a 6-question ultra-quick version so that you can change the conversation. I go to this length to tell you this story so that I can say that I share with you perhaps your unease with what some of these questions will sound like. They are odd, hokey, kooky, different, radically different questions that actually shake up a patient's brain a little bit and make them pay attention. They're used to the, why haven't you done this? Why don't you monitor your sugars? Why don't you exercise? This is going to be different. So the other reason I'm telling you this is because I hope that it sticks and that you walk out of here today with something that you can easily translate into your practice. So let's bring it closer to home. Let's take a patient example, and I'll tell you what happened at St. Barnabas a little bit later. But suffice it to say is that I wasn't the only one who noticed that this conversation that we were having with patients, the standard conversation, was going wrong. Soon after that day, the hospital said to me, Mike, we have too many patients coming back to the hospital. You know, this was the day and age when the revolving door problem was really hitting hospitals hard, and they said, we're losing money, patients are coming back to us sicker and sicker, they're not following up with their outpatient care. You're the shrink here. You and your folks got to do something about this. Train us in something different. Okay, so we'll come back to that.